All right, so we have covered Vietnamese history, history of Vietnam, the Vietnam War, and of course, at the end of the Vietnam War, the global flow of Vietnamese refugees and the pressure on Americans to take in the Vietnamese refugees, and that happened with the passage of the Refugee Act in 1979 and 1980 and 1981. And Vietnamese refugees would um, enter the U.S. and other Western countries, Canada, France, Australia, New Zealand, and so on, up until the 1990s when eventually the last Vietnamese refugee camp was closed. Now, there are some distinctions between a refugee versus an immigrant, and that's what we're going to discuss today, as well as the process of reestablishing their lives in the U.S. as refugees or in other parts of the world as refugees, and the role of the family and the structure of the family in that process. So let me recap just a little bit though. So with the war ending and officially ending in Vietnam in April 30th, 1975, the first wave of Vietnamese refugees, as I mentioned last week, were able to escape with U.S. personnel and U.S. military, and they were the elites. They were the ones who spoke English and French and had ties to U.S. corporations or U.S. Um, military and U.S. government in some way, so their lives were inherently in danger. Now, the other group, though, were the ethnic Chinese Vietnamese. I'm Chinese Vietnamese, and Cambodian too. And this is actually the story of my family in terms of our escape and out of Vietnam, similar to many others. Now, when under the communist government, Vietnam was a very closed society, and things were strict. But there were attempts of Chinese Vietnamese who did not make it out before the war or shortly after the war, shortly after 1975 of April. They were slowly getting out, and they were doing so by bribing personnel, with some of the jewelry, mostly gold that they would have and jade, and they would get passage on a boat, and these little boats would hold hundreds of people, and then the boats would sail off in Vietnam, and they would land at countries of first asylum. Countries of first asylum were mostly the Southeast Asian neighboring countries like Thailand and Indonesia and Malaysia. And after a while, the countries of first asylum were no longer able to hold that many refugees. Hong Kong and the Philippines would also be considered countries of first asylum. They weren't able to accept the hundreds and thousands of refugees coming in by boat, or some overland, but mainly by boat. And so they had to stop. And so this was reported in the news, and then what happened is this became a global refugee crisis. And Jimmy Carter was the president of the United States during that time, and he had a very strong humanitarian inclination. So he did send American vessels out into the South China Sea in order to look for stranded Vietnamese boats of refugees. Now, the U.S. got involved, and the U.S. passed the Refugee Act that allowed Vietnamese refugees to come in as parolees, meaning green card holders. And this was done in part because of international pressure from the international community and from Southeast Asian countries of first asylum saying, you caused this mess and you need to clean it up. So, so the first wave were the wave of Vietnamese elites, who came with U.S. Personnel and military. The second wave, 1979 to 1985, 86, 87, 88, 89, they were mostly Chinese, Vietnamese boat people, and and they were different than the first wave. The first wave being mostly ethnic Vietnamese who were Catholic converts. The second wave being mostly Chinese Vietnamese who practiced Chinese Vietnamese Buddhism and ancestral veneration. So so they came, and when they came, they actually also had, the first wave had a lot of social support from the American public and also funding for resettlement. By the time the second wave came in the 1980s, the United States was in an economic recession, and funding was cut in terms of support for resettlement, and that caused a lot of issues that are still going on today, which we will cover in the next few units of this class. Now, the what we need to know is that the first wave, they came with their families pretty much intact: mom, dad, uncles, aunts, grandparents, kids. The second wave, though, came with fragmented families. Maybe the father came first with the son, and then later on the mother and the younger children, or just the kids alone without their parents. And so this caused some issues in terms of how they arrived. So the Vietnamese American family is complex and diverse. The family will be a chief source of social identity for not just Vietnamese Americans, but all immigrant Americans. Confucianism will play an important role in terms of ancestral veneration and relationships. It will be patriarchal, meaning a male head of household, but that will be flipped within the Vietnamese American community because the mother, the women, will start to work, and kids who speak English and parents who don't will kind of turn around, flip upside down that kind of role where parents become semi childlike because they need to be taken care of by the American English speaking kids. Most of the family will become are extended, meaning more than a nuclear family, mom, dad, and immediate kids, but also will include uncles, aunts, cousins, grandparents. As I mentioned, uh, the second wave families are fragmented because they arrive, not as a whole unit, not as a whole family. So the process of adaptation to American society will become harder, coupled with defunding in terms of housing, social support, medical support. All that will cause strain on the family, and women will and girls will carry on double duty in terms of working as well as supporting the family, and English will become a major issue. Now, the Vietnamese American family is tied to social networks, and social networks meaning temples or ethnic associations, and involvement in ethnic association and involvement in temples or even churches if you're Catholic has shown to help integrate refugees and transition them from refugees to Vietnamese Americans. Um, and and so that brings me back to refugees versus immigrants. A refugee must leave their country at a moment's notice for fear of death or punishment or persecution. Whereas an immigrant has a choice, refugees have no choice. And immigrants can return to their country to visit, refugees cannot. Vietnamese refugees were not able to go back to China until roughly 30 years ago when the United States normalized economic and diplomatic relationships with Vietnam again, beginning under President Clinton, but talks started earlier. All right, so that's it for this lecture.